Our routines were not interrupted by an event most of us didn't even know was taking place, much less understand. War, when we thought of it at all, was something for adults, taking place in lands with strange-sounding names. War seemed heroic to many of us. At least that's how the adults spoke of it.
This could have been one of your grandparents' thoughts as a child during the early stages of World War II, the most devastating and deadliest conflict in history. Taking a step back and analyzing what happened then, it seems impossible that anyone would launch a conflict this great or would let the war escalate to that point. Imagine the people of that time thought the same as you in this moment, but were helpless because of their lack of decision power. Just when the world almost recovered from the first global-scale war, it happened again. Most people treat the causes of World War I as separate from the causes of World War II, which is a reason why they have a wrong point of view about the Second World War, why it triggered, and the frustrations behind it. It's almost as if both wars had the same motive, but the contexts were slightly different. Now we will discover together why both world wars are unquestionably linked and how the stage was set for the Second World War. Stay until the end to understand the Third Reich's economic motives, which formed the basis for the onset of the war. We will delve deeper into the rationale there. Going back in time when Germany was united after the Franco-Prussian War, the newly united state rapidly became a powerful and ambitious country, eager to enter the global stage. However, arriving late in the game, Germany did not gain the prestige it thought it deserved. It was kept out of the major trade networks and couldn't expand its colonial holdings. In short, the German government led by Kaiser Wilhelm felt disrespected. German frustration wasn't the single cause of the First World War, but it was a crucial one. Wilhelm's gamble to gain more influence failed, and the Entente powers defeated them. The aftermath only deepened the rupture between Germany and the world, with the Germans considering themselves humiliated by the victors. Britain and France were hungry for revenge. Therefore, the peace agreement that ended the Great War focused more on punishing Germany than creating a sustainable peace agreement. Obviously, the Treaty of Versailles contained some clauses that most Germans considered embarrassing. For example, Germans were forced to accept complete responsibility for initiating World War I, meaning they were required to make enormous reparations payments. France also demanded excessive quantities of coal, difficult for the defeated side to provide. More painful for the Germans was the alienation of parts from the motherland. These parts were handed to other countries. Here, the United States intervened, insisting that Germany should maintain its sovereignty and should be allowed to rebuild the economy. The defeated side was also allowed to maintain a small military force. This agreement was poorly designed. The peace treaty did not ultimately help to settle the international disputes that had initiated World War I. One of the world leaders, the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, suggested creating an institution similar to the modern United Nations, which would help states resolve their conflicts peacefully. The League was premised on the idea that security threats to one member demanded responses from all members. But when it came time to respond to those threats, the organization largely failed. The newly founded League weakly condemned Germany when it repeatedly violated the Versailles Treaty. Following this minimal response, Japan invaded Manchuria and Italy invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia nowadays. Rather than obey the rules, countries simply exited the League, making it unable to prevent future conflicts. Then, the Great Depression came, leading to the demise of the German regime. The worldwide economic depression had hit the country hard, and millions of people were out of work. The unemployed were joined by millions of others who linked the depression to Germany's national humiliation after defeat in World War I. A myth began to take hold that Germany could have won the war had it not been for unrest at home. This myth, promoted by conservatives and the military, falsely accused Jewish people and left-wing activists of stabbing the country's war effort in the back. Revision of the Versailles Treaty represented one of the factors that gave radical right-wing parties in Germany, including Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party, such influence to mainstream voters in the 1920s and early 1930s. Promises to rearm, to reclaim German territory, particularly in the East, and to regain importance among European and world powers after a humiliating defeat, fueled ultranationalist sentiment and helped average Germans to overlook the more radical views of Nazi ideology, such as creating a much larger, racially pure Germany. In 1933, German President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor of the government. Many of the political elite thought they could control him. Instead, Hitler quickly seized the reins of the country, centralizing power and suspending civil liberties. Germany's short-lived experiment with democracy had failed. Once the Nazis were in power, the democracies required strong policies to counter their ambitions. Instead, they tried to satisfy Hitler's demands to avoid military conflict. Several governments turned a blind eye to the increasing German provocations. At first, the Führer's demands seemed to fall under the category of revanchism, reversing the territorial losses. In 1936, the industrial Ruhr area, a buffer zone, was once again militarized, violating the Versailles Treaty. The stunned French and League of Nations failed to have a proper reaction, which encouraged Hitler to move along with his plan. In 1938, Austria was annexed. Giving the two countries shared language and cultural similarities, the observers accepted it, trying to please Hitler. On the other side of the world, Japan was also dissatisfied with the peace agreements ending World War I. Ironically, they fought against Wilhelm's Germany. However, the sacrifices of the Japanese were not appreciated enough by the Allies. To many in Japan, the international system that emerged after World War I seemed designed to privilege Westerners' access to wealth and resources. A combination between their frustration with their position in the world and the 1929 stock market crash forced Japan towards a militaristic regime. The Japanese were fed up with living at the West's mercy and their monopoly on trade, and they also had long sought to accumulate imperial power. Taiwan became Japan's first colony in 1895, and more territory followed. In 1931, Japan invaded China's Manchuria. This region had an abundance of natural resources that the island nation desperately lacked. After provoking a war in 1937, the Japanese invaded huge parts of China to the south of Manchuria. Returning to Europe, Hitler wanted to annex the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia's mountain region. This region was essential for Czechoslovakia's border security. Both Britain and France sent their prime ministers to negotiate with the Nazi government and finally agreed to the annexation of the area. Hitler agreed, temporarily dismissing future demands on the rest of the country. The British Prime Minister announced that he made, quote, "peace for our time." Unfortunately, Hitler violated this commitment. In 1939, German troops were marching in the Czechoslovakian capital, ending the country's independence. At that moment, the French and British knew they'd been tricked and started war preparations. But Czechoslovakia had an ally nearby, the Soviet Union. But what did they do? Moscow abandoned the Czechoslovakian and signed a non-aggression treaty with Germany. Doing so, they paved Germany's way to begin their campaign in Europe, starting with the lightning-fast invasion of Poland, which was later split between the two giants. London and Paris declared war on Nazi Germany because of their agreement with Poland, but still did nothing more. It seems like the wound left open since World War I led to a Second World War more deadly because of the technological advancements. Earlier in the video, I promised you to tell about the economic reasoning behind the war from the German perspective. Following the Great Depression and the ascension of the Nazis to power, leaders faced the challenge of acquiring resources to support their expansionist agenda. As previously mentioned in the video, Hitler was keen to annex Austria and Czechoslovakia, not solely to expand the nation's borders, but to secure valuable resources like coal and iron ore, essential for industrial production and wartime efforts. The primary economic focus of the Nazi government, setting it apart from prior German administrations, revolved around rearming and bolstering Germany's military in anticipation of securing Lebensraum, or living space, in the East. Consequently, upon assuming power, Hitler stressed that the future of Germany relies solely and entirely on the rebuilding of the Wehrmacht. All other objectives must take a back seat to the task of rearmament, and that, in situations where there is a conflict between the needs of the Wehrmacht and those of other sectors, the interests of the Wehrmacht must always take precedence. This directive was swiftly enacted, with military expenditures surpassing allocations for civilian job creation programs. In the 1930s, world prices for raw materials, comprising the bulk of German imports, were rising, while prices for manufactured goods, Germany's primary exports, were declining. Consequently, Germany struggled to maintain a balance of payments, with a large trade deficit seeming inevitable. Unwilling to accept this prospect, Hitler steered Germany away from partial free trade towards economic self-sufficiency. Recognizing Germany's lack of raw material reserves, He appointed Hjalmar Schacht, a former member of the German Democratic Party, as president of the Reichsbank in 1933 and Minister of Economics in 1934. Inherited policies included large public works programs funded by deficit spending, such as the construction of the Autobahn network aimed at stimulating the economy and reducing unemployment, which stood at approximately 30%. As Germany expanded its territory during the war, it exploited the resources and labor of occupied countries, employing slave labor from concentration camps and plundering occupied territories, yielding economic advantages at immense human cost. By the late 1930s, German trade policy aimed to leverage economic and political power to render southern European and Balkan countries dependent on Germany. These regions would supply raw materials to the German economy, receiving German manufactured goods in return. With the outbreak of war, the arms industry flourished, providing employment and economic stimulus. However, this wartime economy was unsustainable long-term and relied heavily on conquest and exploitation.